The conflict between Israel and Hamas is intensifying, and the region is seething over an explosion at a Gaza hospital. Washington's ability to prevent a wider war is becoming more complicated. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports.
President Joe Biden was warmly embraced by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Wednesday as he made a high-stakes wartime visit to demonstrate U.S. solidarity after the brutal October 7th attacks by Hamas militants on Israeli civilians. But the explosion that killed hundreds of Palestinians Tuesday night at a Gaza hospital thwarted any such embrace from Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas or Jordan's King Abdullah, who canceled their planned meetings with Biden. Both Israel and Hamas deny they are responsible for the hospital blast. In Israel, Biden persuaded Netanyahu to allow international humanitarian aid in to help Gaza's 2.2 million residents, who are in desperate need of food, water, and fuel, saying he hoped crossings will begin Friday.
Israel agreed humanitarian assistance can begin to move from Egypt to Gaza.
Protesters took to the streets in Istanbul and many other cities across the world Wednesday and Thursday in support of Palestinians and against Israeli attacks on Gaza. Some protesters also expressed outrage at the United States for backing Israel, despite intensive shuttle diplomacy by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who met with Arab leaders across the region. While Blinken and Biden were visiting the Middle East, Russian President Vladimir Putin was welcomed to Beijing by Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Addressing the Israel-Hamas conflict, Putin said that the growing number of world conflicts strengthens ties between Moscow and Beijing. Russia and China have refused to condemn the Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians. One expert told VOA this crisis has shown that the U.S. is now the only superpower in the Middle East.
It is the only superpower that has real military assets, and that's not just assets that it's going to give to Israel in the conflict. It's the 2 aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the security relationships with Jordan, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with surrounding countries, and it is the diplomatic bandwidth to do the kind of conversations and activities that you've seen Secretary Blinken and the president engage in.
Russia and China are working together to upend the global order established after the Second World War. Former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger told VOA.
And now that she is hosting Vladimir Putin in Beijing, it's a continuation of this deepening partnership to try to drive chaos in Europe, to drive chaos in the Middle East, to eventually try to drive chaos right in China's front yard.
But another expert told VOA that, unlike Russia, China's interests in the Middle East may be more in line with America's.
I think China's interest in the Middle East is not for more war and instability, because they're even more dependent on the energy resources of the region.
Katula said that the decision by Palestinian and Egyptian leaders not to meet with Biden so soon after the hospital explosion is not necessarily a sign they are not willing to work with the United States, but that they are sensitive to the reactions on their own streets. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
Okay, for more on this, we are now being joined by VOA's Jessica Stone, live from the White House. Hi, Jessica. Good morning. It looks like President Biden is going to have some European guests today. Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, and Charles Michel, head of the European Council, and the European Union's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, are at the White House today to meet with the U.S. president. Why is Washington meeting with them, and what's on the agenda?
Well, this was a meeting that was set even before the Israel-Hamas war began. But the big thing that Washington is looking for out of this meeting with respect to Europe is coordination on getting aid to the Gazans. For example, we see reports just in the last hour that the aid deal that President Biden talked about in his speech last night is running into some snags with inspection, with ongoing bombardments at the border. And it's certainly something that both the United States and the Europeans can work on together to coordinate aid to the Gazans, because they've been under siege by Israel since all of this began. And coordination also in recovering the hostages. There are estimates somewhere around a couple hundred hostages, and many of them are Americans or dual citizenships with the United States or with Europe. And the U.S. is engaging with Qatar to try to free them. Qatar has increasingly played that role both for the Americans and for the Europeans to work on hostage negotiation. They were instrumental in getting those 5 American hostages out of Iran. The Hamas has an office now in Qatar since 2012, I believe. And so there is an ongoing relationship that Qatar can leverage with respect to that. On the question of Ukraine, though, this is also, something else that these two partners are going to discuss today here at the White House. On the question of Ukraine, Washington has been trying to reassure the EU that it's not going to take its eye off funding to Ukraine in light of what's happening with the Israel-Hamas war and in light of GOP opposition, particularly in the House, to additional funding. For example, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was in Europe on Monday. She said that literally the U.S. is going to be able to do both. And the Biden administration is expected to announce formally sometime today that it is requesting $100 billion from Congress in a supplemental emergency package to include Israel, Ukraine, border security, as well as security measures for Taiwan. Susan?
Yeah, last night, President Biden, during his address from the Oval Office, time and again drew parallels between Hamas and Vladimir Putin's Russia. And now he's tying this $100 billion aid funding together, where these interests are intersecting. Do you think that there is a less chance of this request passing in a divided Congress, considering the fact that Ukraine is being lumped in with Israel and Taiwan, and of course the border as well?
Well, he's doing that because this is an effort to get this legislation passed and get buy-in from all corners of Congress. The New York Times has a report about how the money will be divvied up. They say $10 billion goes to Israel for military assistance, $60 billion for Ukraine, the remainder to be split between security assistance to Taiwan and to border security. And they also make the point that these funds are going to last for a fiscal year. So they are not just a temporary injection of funds to these different entities. That's important because there are many members on the right of the Republican Party that don't want to do temporary spending. They want to do a long-term spending, if at all, and they want to also see cuts, and they want to see a winning strategy from the White House in Ukraine. That's been the skepticism that's been shaping their votes on not funding more Ukraine spending. Lawmakers who support spending in Ukraine are also supporting spending in Israel. Some of them are also supporting Taiwan spending. And certainly the border is a hot button issue for the right flank of the Republican Party and for many Republicans writ large, in that if it's all put together, it has a much likelier chance of passage. That's the thinking at the White House, at least from what we understand. And we'll have to see how this plays out in Congress. But it is also, very much being shaped by what's going on with the speaker's race. Right now, we don't have a functioning Congress at all. And so that plays into this as well.
Yeah, unbelievable. Jessica, please stay with me. I'll talk to you again shortly. The U.S. imposed sanctions limiting Iran's drone and missile program this week in response to the Islamic Republic's backing of the October 7th Hamas massacre against Israel. But as VOA's congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson reports, U.S. lawmakers are now divided on how to approach Iran and its support for Hamas as the war in Israel intensifies.
The Biden administration's prisoner swap with Iran just weeks before the start of the war in Israel, once again facing scrutiny on Capitol Hill.
We know that Iran bankrolls Hamas, and yet it is perplexing why this administration refuses to issue a formal decision to freeze the $6 billion.
The U.S. Treasury has said it will block Iran's access to the $6 billion in assets, which are currently being held in Qatar. But the Senate bill is seeking an official policy change to further prevent Iran from tapping the funds. The U.S. does not have direct evidence tying Iran to the militant group's attack on Israel, but lawmakers remain concerned about its long-term support.
Iran and Hamas is obvious. It's lasted more than a decade. Hamas doesn't have the resources to have the type of weapon systems that they've been using or the training to use them without somebody like Iran.
In return for the release of 5 prisoners, the United States agreed to unfreeze $6 billion in Iranian assets and transfer them to Qatar as an intermediary. While legislation to refreeze that money has some bipartisan support, Senate Foreign Relations Chairman Ben Cardin told VOA it has not yet been transferred to Iran.
There's been no request for these funds, so they're not being released. I need to have a conversation with the Biden administration to see the current status.
Other Senate Democrats argue the money sends a powerful message about U.S. intentions in the region.
There was great care given to the fact that this money had to be fenced off so that it could only be used essentially for humanitarian purposes. And I'm talking about medicine, medical devices, food, and agricultural products. And let's keep in mind that, yes, we have an adversary in Iran with the Ayatollahs, with the Iran Revolutionary Guard. But there are Iranians who are suffering.
But Republican Senator Ted Cruz telling VOA the $6 billion is just part of a larger Biden administration approach of appeasement towards Iran.
Under Joe Biden, nearly $100 billion have flowed to Iran. So absolutely, the $6 billion should be frozen. But so should the $10 billion to Iran that the Biden administration freed up 3 weeks earlier. And on top of that, so should the $80 billion in oil profits today.
Cruz and other Senate Republicans arguing Biden's nominee to be U.S. ambassador to Israel, Jack Lew, should be disqualified due to his role negotiating the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Lew pushing back during his confirmation hearing Wednesday.
Iran is a threat to regional stability and to Israel's existence. If confirmed, I will uphold President Biden's commitment to deny Iran a nuclear weapon and warning to the region that anyone who's thinking of taking advantage of the current crisis.
Republican senators are expected to block Lew's nomination when it comes up for a full vote on the Senate floor in the near future. Catherine Gibson, VOA News.
Okay, VOA's Jessica Stone is still joining us from the White House. Jessica, thanks for sticking around. This current situation with the search for a House Speaker, how does it impact the work of the House of Representatives at this point, even dealing with Iran?
Yeah, it's an important question because there's really paralysis on Capitol Hill. We've gone 16 days now without a House Speaker. That means that the House of Representatives, the lower chamber of the U.S. Congress, can't legislate, can't move legislation. And in terms of looking for a new leader of the Republican majority in the House, Jim Jordan, a Trump acolyte, has emerged as a potential House Speaker. He's running for the role, but he's lost 2 successive votes, both on Tuesday and Wednesday. They were going to call a vote on Thursday. They decided not to. At one point, he threw his hat out of the race, backing a plan to just empower the temporary speaker, a congressman from North Carolina, for the role. But that would require working with Democrats. And there are many on the right, even on Jim Jordan's right, who say that's not tenable. We're not going to work with Democrats to get the process moving forward. We need to find a House Speaker. Jim Jordan then put his hat back in the ring, and we understand that there's going to be a vote today at 10 to see if he can muster the votes to become the next House Speaker after the Republicans Republicans ousted by a narrow majority Kevin McCarthy 16 days ago.
I'd love to get your opinion on how Americans feel about not only this gridlock, but do Republicans or Americans in general care who's Speaker of the House, or do they care more that their party is leading the House of Representatives? Do you think that lawmakers in Washington are attaching too much importance to who is actually the Speaker?
I mean, I think that's something for the Republicans to debate among themselves. But what we know from polling of American voters on both sides of the aisle is that they have long blamed Congress for dysfunction. And typically they have blamed the majority party for the source of that dysfunction. What we've seen in the last 2 weeks is that whereas 2 weeks ago, an Economist YouGov poll showed that voters blamed people on both sides, parties on both sides equally, for what almost led to the government shutdown. Now we're seeing through a new poll from Yahoo News and YouGov that Americans are blaming Republicans more than Democrats for the current chaos. 2/3 of those surveyed, and that survey was just released in the last day or so, say that conservative and moderate Republicans are to blame for that dysfunction. And I got to tell you, in private conversations with Republican operatives, they are telling me that they are not expecting to keep the House of Representatives. It's a very narrow majority, and they're very concerned about keeping the majority going into next year's election cycle.
Oh, wow. Jessica Stone, thank you so much for all of that analysis and update, joining us live from the White House this morning. Thanks.